Okay. So what you're looking at in the image here is a giant sequoia. You can buy these online. It's just a little seedling for probably like $10. And if you're in the right conditions and you plant it in your backyard and feed it everything it needs and give it all the right conditions and wait, I don't know, 50 or 100 or 200 years, you might end up with something like this in your backyard. This is General Sherman. It is the largest living single-stemmed organism known in the world. It's about 275 feet high, and it's estimated to weigh a little over 4 million pounds. So somehow, General Sherman started off as a little seedling like this, and over many, many, many years grew up to be this big, giant tree. And if you were, heaven forbid, to cut this tree down, dry it out, and weigh it, so get all the water out of it, where do you predict that all the mass that you'd be weighing comes from? So when it grew from this big to this big, where did all that weight come from? So go ahead and just click in on that question. Let me see what y'all think. And remember, you're drying it out and then weighing it. So think of like, logs that you get that are all dried out. They still weigh a lot, right? Going once. Going twice. Going 3 times. Sold. About 15% are saying A, water. 3% are saying B, sunlight. 64% are saying C, minerals and soil. And 17% are saying D, CO2 in the air. So let's watch this. That. Pause this. Crank the volume up a bit.
For a second. Okay. Imagine that I planted that in the ground, okay, and a tree grew. All right. And here is a piece of that tree. Sure. Okay. Now, where did all that stuff come from? So where do plants come from? You look at this beautiful big neighbor trees, this great spread barrels. And you know they start from this little tiny seed. It's miraculous. Where does all that weight come from?
The mass came from a lot of things, I guess. I guess from water that it sucked up from the ground. I would guess from mineral that it sucked up from the ground.
Water, light, soil.
Well, I suppose in terms of raw mass, most of it's probably derived from actually like matter in the soil itself, and some of it comes from water, obviously, but a large amount of it comes from the nutrients that the roots absorb from the soil.
Now, what would you say to someone who said to you that most of the weight of the tree came from the carbon dioxide of the air?
I would say I would have no idea what to think about.
I would disagree because this same volume of air would weigh this much unless it was highly compressed. I think that's very disturbing and wonder how that could happen.
It's a very strange idea. That somehow the air, which they view as nothing, as weightless, as insubstantial, somehow makes a tree, a giant tree that weighs several tons. That's absolutely incredible.
That'd be hard to believe. It's carbon dioxide is it's a gas. It doesn't seem like it doesn't seem intuitive that you could have mass taken in a gas.
That's where it comes from. Takes this carbon molecules and packs them together. Do the chemical reactions so tight that you get this huge mass. So what does it mean? These Harvard graduates don't understand the fundamental idea of photosynthesis. Well, it's symbolic of the state of the nation. These are the best that we produce. They don't understand it. After all these years of school, who does?
Right, so picking up where we left off, this idea that all that weight doesn't in fact come from minerals in soil, but in fact comes from, oops, what just happened? The air. So I want to talk through this in a little bit more detail, talking about what happens to CO2 and light in plants. And you'll be basically looking at, you can see that this the carbon atom in this CO2 molecule is outlined in red. And you can kind of follow that individual carbon atom throughout this slide. So you have CO2 and light. CO2 and light, hopefully you know by now, is involved in the process of photosynthesis, where you take the C in carbon dioxide and reduce it to this higher energy glucose molecule and the carbon atoms in. So you're turning CO2 into sugars essentially. And you're using light in this process to basically provide the energy to make this higher energy sugar molecule. And so the energy that's in light is essentially converted from light energy into the chemical energy in the bonds of these sugars or these glucose molecules, the C6H12O6. This is the process of photosynthesis, where you're essentially converting inorganic CO2 carbon into organically useful carbon in the form of glucose, and you're converting light energy into organically and biologically useful chemical energy. Now from here, these glucose molecules can basically go through the process of cellular respiration. So you've got these sugar molecules, they combine with oxygen, and they get converted basically back into, so that carbon atom that's in sugar gets converted back into CO2 through the process of cellular respiration. And in the process, the cells produce a bunch of ATP, and this is sort of like the currency of the cell. This is why plants go through all this trouble to make that glucose. And so ultimately, it can get converted into ATP and power all these other sort of cellular processes. This is, of course, the process of cellular respiration. And it's important to remember that plant cells not only have chloroplasts, but they also have mitochondria. So those chloroplasts are sending that sugar right over to the mitochondria to make this ATP and essentially take those carbon atoms that were once CO2 and turned into sugars and turning them right back into CO2 and turning the energy in those bonds into essentially the bonds in ATP that can be used for other cellular processes. So most of you are probably familiar with this idea of photosynthesis, cellular respiration. And maybe it's just a reminder to you that like, oh yeah, plants also have mitochondria. Because I know when I was an undergrad, I don't think it was until I reached grad school that I recognized like, oh yeah, plants also have mitochondria. That's odd. I always thought they just had chloroplasts. But there's another thing that happens. And that's some of these carbon atoms that are in glucose can actually get used to make other important molecules that make up the biomass of a plant. So things like cellulose, things like nucleotides, things like the macromolecules, things like starch, all of these molecules that make up the overall biomass of a plant come from these carbon atoms that were initially CO2 in the air and got converted through photosynthesis into glucose. And so this is another process that you may not be familiar with that we just sort of generally refer to in this class as biosynthesis. There's much more formal sort of terms for this that we're not going to get into all the details of, but for now, just accept it as this is basically taking that CO2 that came out of the air and got turned into glucose and turning it into the carbon-based molecules that make up the biomass of a plant. And so trees basically take carbon and CO2 and turn it into part of the carbon atoms that make up their biomass, assuming that that carbon isn't used up in the cellular respiration process. So if you think about a potato plant, it's got these potatoes that are full of cellulose, they're full of starch, they're full of all these other molecules that make them up. Those potatoes and those French fries that you're eating, those sugars and those starches that you're eating were initially carbon atoms that were CO2 molecules in the air, which is kind of crazy to think about. So, given that, what is the answer to this question? Going once, going twice, 3 times. And so 90% are saying D is the false statement, and that is correct. And you are all smarter than Harvard grads now. Congratulations. So a plant's dry weight comes not from the minerals in the soil, but in fact come from the incorporation of carbon atoms from the CO2 in the atmosphere into the plant's biomass. So we've talked a little bit now about the importance of CO2 and carbon, and that being a really important macronutrient for organisms in general, and also how plants bring in that carbon now through photosynthesis in their leaves and their above ground systems. But there are other essential nutrients for plants to live and survive. And they're usually broken down into these 3 major types: primary, secondary, and micronutrients. And N, P, and K, or nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are really essential primary nutrients for plants to grow. These other ones are also essential, so things like calcium, magnesium, sulfur, chlorine, iron, zinc, manganese, boron, copper, and molybdenum, but N, P, and K are especially important ones. And this fundamentally breaks down, or is fundamentally because they are essential parts of the monomers that make up the very important polymers or macromolecules that we talked about that are essential to all life. So amino acids make up proteins. Those have nitrogen, and oftentimes nitrogen and phosphorus as some of their key constituents. If you look at nucleotides, they also have nitrogen and phosphorus as part of their key constituents as well. So you can't make nucleotides and amino acids without nitrogen and phosphorus. Sugars don't really fall into this group because they don't have nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium in them. Really, they just depending on having C's, O's, and H's to build them up. But nitrogen and phosphorus are really important for building the monomers that make up nucleic acids and proteins. And obviously, you need those to build a plant. So how do plants go about acquiring nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all these other secondary and micronutrients? Perhaps not surprisingly, they acquire them through their root system, which collects water, minerals, and nutrients from the soil. So let's talk a little bit more detail about the root system itself and nutrient uptake through the roots. So if you were to look at an individual root, it would look something like this, where it's got a bunch of different vascular tissue and other cell types that basically selectively and actively uptake nutrients. When I say selectively, it means they let in the good stuff, they keep out the bad stuff. When I say actively, it means they're usually expending energy to pump and suck those nutrients up, but not always, but oftentimes. So the breakdown of the sort of different types of cells, if you take that make up a root, if you cut one in half, hot dog style, you can see that on the outside, it's got these little root hairs. Then there's an epidermal layer of cells. There's the root cortex cells. There are these endodermal cells. And then it's penetrated by the vascular tissues like the phloem and the xylem so that they can get sugars down into the roots to feed them and help them grow. And also the xylem to suck the water and minerals out of the roots up to the rest of the plant. I wouldn't expect you to memorize all of these terms or anything like that. Just understand that they're made up of complex different types of tissues. And basically, the jobs of these different types of tissues are to move minerals from the soil into the root cells using a combination of transpiration, which remember is just basically water evaporating up through the stomata at the leaves and sucking water all the way up from the roots up through the rest of the plant. Active transport, which is using ATP and energy to basically actively pump stuff across cell membranes, and osmosis, where basically you're just moving water down its sort of concentration gradient, or I guess up against the solute gradient. And when water and other minerals are moving into and across these different layers of cells, there is this one special sort of layer called the Casparian strip. I once again wouldn't expect you to memorize this, but just understand that these are the sort of bouncers or the specialized cells that are saying these are the stuff that are good things that can get through, and this is the bad stuff that is potentially like a pathogen or a chemical that we want to try to keep out. And if you were to look, so this is a very cartoonish version of the root hairs. If you were to look more closely at the actual hairs on a root, you'd see that they're very, very fine, and there's very, very many of them. And this structure of having all these sort of hairs covering a root is related to its function. So why do you think it would be useful to have all these root hairs? That's right. I heard a whisper of increased surface area. That's right. Surface area to volume ratios. When in doubt about any question related to structure or function, 9 times out of 10, the answer is going to be surface area to volume ratios. And this is another example of that, where having more root hairs gives you much more surface area to be more efficient in absorbing nutrients and grabbing all the nutrients the plant can get out of the soil. And you can actually increase this even more through this cooperative mutualism that plants have to increase their surface area to volume ratio even more with mycorrhizal fungi. So what you're looking at here is a seedling plant, and you can see the brown part is kind of the root coming down. And then you can see all this sort of white stuff growing off of those roots. And those white things are hyphae of mycorrhizal fungi that are in a mutualistic relationship with this plant. And as it turns out, almost all vascular plants have this mutualistic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi are a bunch of different species of fungi that all fall in this group called mycorrhizae because they associate with plant roots. And about 80% of plant species, vascular plant species, have mycorrhizal fungi, and about 92% of plant families have these mycorrhizal fungi, so super common. And part of the reason for this is because hyphae are even thinner than plant roots and plant hairs, about 10 to 50 times thinner. So they increase, they basically create a much higher surface area to volume ratio for nutrient absorption when they associate with these plant roots. And those thin hyphae allow fungi to access nutrients in the soil, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, that the plants can't get to because they're just sort of not thin enough and able to get access to all these little tiny cracks and fissures in the soil. And so this is, once again, a mutualistic or mutualism. It's a symbiotic relationship where two organisms live together and both benefit. Both the plant and the fungi benefit from this relationship. This is called a mutualism. And the reason that it's a mutualism is because the fungus benefits by getting all the sugars produced by photosynthesis and brought down from the phloem into the roots and are distributed to the fungus. So the plant gives the fungus some sugars, and in exchange, the plant gets phosphorus and nitrogen from that fungus. So both members benefit. And this is not what's called an obligate mutualism. Obligate means like if you take one partner away from the other one dies. Plants can still survive without mycorrhizal fungi, but they just don't grow as well because they're not getting as much nitrogen and phosphorus as they would otherwise. So here you can see an example of a plant grown without mycorrhizal fungi, and here's that same sort of plant grown in the same conditions, everything else the same except the mycorrhizae are removed, and you can see that obviously this plant is larger and healthier because it's getting more nitrogen and phosphorus. So it's really beneficial to have these mycorrhizal fungi. Some other adaptations that plants have to get access to nutrients. You may be familiar with carnivorous plants, either a Venus flytrap, like you see here with the little fly that it's trapped in it, or different types of pitcher plants that have evolved. And typically, we find these types of plants almost exclusively in soils that have low amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so essentially what they've done is they've evolved a way to supplement the low amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus that they're not receiving from the soils by digesting and breaking down the nitrogen that are and phosphorus that are more readily available in their insect prey. I don't know where that's coming from. I thought that was me. This is still, just to be clear, these plants are still considered photoautotrophs because they're still getting energy from the sun and they're still getting carbon from CO2. It's just that they're supplementing these other nutrients that they're lacking, like nitrogen and phosphorus from the soils. Okay, so what is the answer to this question? Going once. Going twice. 3 times. And sold 71% are saying B, 21% are saying D. The correct answer is in fact B. So let's go through these. A, plants typically collect important minerals like N and P through their leaves and shoot systems. Nope, they collect CO2 and light through the leaves and shoot systems. N and P are got through the root systems. Carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps are typically found in low light environments. Nope, typically low N and P environments. Carnivory helps get more N and P. Plants can form a mutualism with mycorrhizal fungi, which increases the plant's uptake of sugars from the soil. Nope, mycorrhizal fungi get the sugars from the plant. This mutualism with mycorrhizal fungi helps the plant get more nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. And so B was the correct choice. Having flat leaves is a trade-off. So let's talk a little bit more about why nitrogen and phosphorus matter. So we talked about how these are key constituents in the monomers that make up those polymers or important macromolecules like amino acids making up proteins, like nucleotides, making up nucleic acids. You can't make those things without nitrogen and phosphorus. But what is it specifically about nitrogen and phosphorus that make them important? And part of understanding this fundamentally is understanding something called Leibigs' law of the minimum. And basically all that Leibigs' law of the minimum says is that growth is controlled not by all of the resources that are available, but it's simply limited by the scarcest resource. So this barrel metaphor is a great way to think about Leibigs' law of the minimum, where the amount that something grows is the amount of water that fills up the barrel. And each of the little planks on the barrel represents a different sort of major nutrient that that organism needs to grow. And the water can only go as high as the lowest plank or the least or limiting nutrient in the system. So the only way you can get this water to go higher is if you put, in this case, the limiting nutrient is water. So maybe we're in like a desert system. If you increase the amount of water, then the growth will increase. And then maybe nitrogen becomes the next limiting resource. So this is Leibigs' law of the minimum. And as it turns out, nitrogen and phosphorus are often the limiting nutrients in many, many different types of ecosystems. So just to give you an idea here, there's lots of experimental evidence for Leibigs' law of the minimum. And so this figure is looking at freshwater, marine, and terrestrial habitat types and measuring increases in plant growth when you experimentally add nitrogen or phosphorus to the system. And it's just looking at when we add these different nutrients, how much does plant growth increase above the baseline if we didn't add nutrients? So the way you interpret this graph is right here where it's 0 on here, where this arrow is pointing. Basically, this is the baseline amount of growth. This is how much plants grow in that system if you didn't add any extra nutrients to it. And then if I add in red bars here is nitrogen. If I add in nitrogen, this is how much more above the baseline the plants grow. And if I experimentally add in more phosphorus, this is how much more above the baseline the plants grow. And if I add in both nitrogen and phosphorus simultaneously, this is how much more above the baseline those plants grow in this particular system. So given that, what's the answer to this question? Going once, going twice, 3 times, and sold. 78% are saying C. And C is the correct answer. So in all of these systems, both nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting. And the reason we know that is because when we add nitrogen and phosphorus, represented by the purple bars in both the freshwater, marine, and terrestrial systems, those purple bars show a greater increase in growth than adding either one alone. So adding both of them has a larger effect than adding one individually. So that means both nitrogen and phosphorus are limiting in these systems. And what's the answer to this question? Going once. Going twice. 3 times. And sold. 53% are saying A, 10% B, 36% C. The correct answer here is A. And the reason for that is because there is the largest jump in growth when we add both nitrogen and phosphorus to this system. So that means that if you think about the barrel metaphor, the lowest plank in the barrel is nitrogen and phosphorus. And when we lift those up, it has the largest lift in growth. So it's the major limiting factor, and that's bringing nitrogen and phosphorus up to the same level as all the other nutrients in the system. Whereas here, when we add the same amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus to the marine and terrestrial system, it's bringing that plank up, but now there's other things in the system that are limiting it. And so it's not growing as high as it is in the freshwater system. So that means that N and P are the most limiting in this freshwater system, whereas other nutrients are becoming limiting at quicker or sooner rates in these other two systems. All right, let's try this question. And here we're looking at just these bars, just the terrestrial system. Ignore the marine and the freshwater ones. You're looking just here. Going once. Going twice. 3 times. So looks like we got a bit of a stumper here. So 38% are saying A, 45% are saying B, 9% are saying C, 8% are saying D. So talk to the person next to you and click in one more time. Going once. Going twice. Going 3 times. Sold. We're up to 50% A, 40% B, and then stragglers in C and D. The correct answer is A. So let me walk you through this. Basically, all this is saying is when we add nitrogen, there's growth above the baseline rate. So when we add nitrogen, now there's an increase in growth. So that means that nitrogen was limiting in that system. Because when we add it, now it grows more. So there was not enough nitrogen in that system. But when we add phosphorus, what happens to growth above baseline? Nothing. So that means phosphorus isn't limiting. You can dump as much phosphorus as you want into this system. It's not going to grow any more above baseline because phosphorus is not limiting. It's nitrogen that's limiting. And so it's only going to grow above that baseline if you add more nitrogen in. So we see no increase in growth when we add phosphorus. And then even more so, when we add both nitrogen and phosphorus, look, it only goes up to the same baseline where nitrogen does. So it's essentially functionally the same thing as adding in the same amount of just nitrogen. So 2 pieces of evidence. Adding phosphorus doesn't increase growth, and when we add both nitrogen and phosphorus, it only increases the same amount as when we just add nitrogen. So this is a nitrogen limited system. All right, try this one. And once again, you're only looking at the terrestrial stuff. Ignore marine, ignore freshwater. We're only looking here. Going once, going twice, 3 times, and sold. 91% are saying D. Y'all get it. That's correct. The answer is neither, because we're dumping all this nitrogen and phosphorus in and it's not increasing growth at all. So some other nutrient, something else is limiting the growth in that system. That's exactly right. So a couple take homes here. Number one, nitrogen and phosphorus are often limiting nutrients, but they're not always, but they often are, especially when we're talking about photosynthetic organisms. Which nutrients is or are limiting really depends on the environment and local conditions, whether in freshwater, marine, or terrestrial, or other types of systems. And ultimately, you really need experiments to know for sure what the limiting nutrient is. So we can talk about some of the applications of this Leibigs law of the minimum. The first example being, of course, fertilizers. So we already know that typically nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are limiting plant growth in many, many different systems. And so when you try to put fertilizer or go and buy fertilizer to throw on your plants in your garden or your house, they're almost always going to say NPK, NPK, NPK. That's because they have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it, because they already know these are the limiting nutrients for plant growth in many systems. This is also related to toxic algal blooms. So you may have heard of these at your local waterways where you go swimming. You may see sludge in the water. You may see signs that say harmful algal blooms, beach closed. Or you may have seen some of these articles that say dogs died from toxic algae after swimming, where basically there's these big blooms or outbreaks or booms of algal populations in the water. And this is typically linked to agricultural runoff and fertilizers like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium moving into waterways where there were once limiting nutrients, but now there's this huge outbreak because those are no longer limiting and the algae start growing like crazy. And they've done actual experiments looking at which fertilizers are linked to these types of algal blooms. And here what they did is they had a giant freshwater lake. They put a big divider and cut it in half. On one side, they added just carbon and nitrogen. On the other side, they added carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And as you can see, there's an algal bloom on the phosphorus side, whereas on the other side, the water looks more or less normal or okay. And so as it turns out, in most freshwater systems, phosphorus is one of the major limiting nutrients that when it gets dumped into the system causes these algal blooms. So this is important for regulating these types of algal blooms. It's also important if you actually, on the other way, want to grow algae. So many biofuels depend on photoautotropic organisms, so growing these sort of microalgae. And if you want to grow them at a very optimal rate, you want to have all the nutrients at their sort of maximum. So no limiting nutrient, and you got to get them all in just the right amount so that that algae can grow at reach its maximum growing potential, so you can grow it and harvest it for biofuels. And that's what a lot of these folks work on. And this is fundamentally applying Leibigs' law of the minimum and making sure that no nutrient is limiting their growth potential. So these are the take-home messages for plant and nutrient acquisition. This is a slide with a ton of words that I am not going to read to you. I expect you to go and look at this later on another point when you're studying for the exams. I'm also 99.9% sure that everything here is also on the study guide for our next coming exam. But I just wanted to make sure these were listed in a place for you in case you come away from these lectures saying, what the hell was I supposed to get out of that, Dr. Hyman? Well, this is the main sort of take homes from all this info. Does anyone have any questions about any of this stuff? Okay, have a good weekend.